Okay, amazing. So without further ado, we begin this debate by calling on the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Am I audible and visible enough for everybody?
Both. Perfect.
Awesome. Just give me a second. I'll start my speech now. Okay. All right. I'll take POIs, most likely around 5. So, you have any POI? Let's hesitate to ask out most likely. Oh, yeah, cool. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to prove eventually is that the predominance of anti-Ottoman narrative within these particular states has led to the creation of modern-day oppressive governments in a way that restricts accountability, restricts progress, restricts inclusion within that particular state, and annihilates majority of minority groups that exist there in a way that is pernicious. What this means is not to say that states shouldn't acknowledge the point in history where they had to fight oppressors. What we say is that if that emphasis is huge to a point where it inflates the relevance of modern day governments in a way that makes them themselves oppressive, that limits the ability for people to self-actualize and recreate the very oppressive mechanisms that they celebrate opposition and they celebrate opposing, then we oppose in this debate. 3 things I'm going to do as a point of framing. A, what does this emphasis look like, right? Most of the time, this is the predominant narrative in terms of national rhetoric. So most conversations are built around hatred for the Ottoman Empire or built around never returning to the Ottoman Empire. And so politicians who say, I'm never going to make sure that, I'm always going to make sure that we never return to the Ottoman Empire, tend to ride on most of these rhetorics and tend to pry on these fears to inflate their relevance. Secondly, they are usually woven into tools that drive national identity. For instance, the national pledge, the national anthem, holidays, things that kids are subjected to over and over again every single day when they are in school, to imbibe into them the idea that the state is a savior from the kind of things that happened in the Ottoman Empire. Thirdly, they form majority major part of the country's political foundations. So you have parties that were founded on the idea that we saved the state and we liberated, or our leaders were the ones who liberated us from the Ottoman Empire. What this means is that they are able to ride on this political privilege and elitism in a way that gives them a huge inflationary advantage. Fourthly, they are portrayed as the most, this specific period is portrayed as the most important and significant part of the history of those particular states. Because note, before the Ottoman Empire was created, these states and these groups of people had pre-existing history, they had pre-existing formations, they had pre-existing shared identities, which means that in the instance where this emphasis happens, it usually washes away the relevance of the pre-existing history prior to the time of fighting the Ottoman Empire, and I would explain why this mechanism of forming national identity is inherently problematic. But finally, they treat most of the years by which they liberated themselves from the Ottoman Empire as year 0 for those particular states, not acknowledging that there were years where these states existed before the creation and opposition of the Ottoman Empire. Why is this important, and how does this affect the state? 3 mechanisms. A, because most of the time they form exclusionary national identities, only praising freedom fighters. And note, these freedom fights were usually formed on narrow insurgencies. Specific ethnic groups were predominant in these particular freedom fights, which means that there is a prioritization of specific identities in a way that excludes majority of the people who do not fit into the period of that particular resistance movement. Secondly, they inflate the relevance of the history and the country and give them savior complexes, which they build parties on in a way that reduce accountability. So they say that we deserve this because we saved the country from its worst moment, in a way that they're able to use it to erode majority of the accountability systems and prevent people from being more more critical about their evaluation and being much more soft, because we owe them big time for saving us in the biggest moment of these particular countries. Thirdly, they treat these times as year zero, like I said, and this justifies the fact that they need a longer period of time to create change within these particular states, because they say we are a new state, we were formed not long ago, without recognizing that there were huge systems that existed before this liberation movement, in a way that justifies corruption, slow development, that limits the people to the ability for people to access quality education and self-actualize. On our side, here's the comparative. You treat these resistance movements as a single point in history and not as being the beginning of history. So for instance, Germany and the way they treat the Holocaust, they treat it as a point in history. Germany has a rich history prior to the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. They don't treat the Holocaust as the beginning of history for most of these countries. And this means that the benefits of people knowing about this, people being taught about this somehow in schools, etc., is fine. People can know their history books and people can be educated on these things. We regret the emphasis in a way that carves this in deeply into national identities like exist in Serbia and some of the countries that have been listed, right? And I'll be able to explain this. But secondly, what this means is that we appreciate the pre-Ottoman Empire, the pre-Ottoman era in the formation of national identities, because identities that existed prior to that time are now included in the way in which we form national identities. So most of these people, even though they didn't partake in the liberation fight, are captured and appreciated in the way in which we resort to national identities, which is much more inclusive fundamentally within the way in which that state is formed. Before I move on, CEO.
Yeah, why is nationalism inherently exclusive? Because we see nationalism in some countries in the world where they can become inclusive.
No, so this is not a debate about nationalism. This is specifically the way in which that nationalism is carved. And that's why I spent time describing how this emphasis happens. This emphasis happens in a way in which inherently within its creation annihilates majority of people from being included in the way in which that state is crafted. The good nationalism that you want to talk about appreciates everybody within that state. And that's the comparative that exists. First, three things then. First, on corruption and accountability. I think I've analyzed the premises on which most of this happened already, and representation. But what it means is that majority of political elites right from pop out from most of these ethnic groups and groups that participated in these resistance movements, because then they're able to ride on the narrative of privilege, and from that heritage are able to create that they have a rich history for their family line sacrificing for the state, etc., in a way that creates political cabals that entrench themselves within that particular state and limit accountability, limit accessibility and representation within the political system, and they hugely benefit from this savior complex. What this means that most of these guys are subject to corruption. Look at Serbia. Vučić literally has extended his time in office illegally. He's created massive appointments for friends and family in the central government. And look at Greece. Corruption and mismanagement that nearly collapsed the state simply because they create the perception that they are beyond accountability because they have a huge place within this country's history. Secondly, inclusion into national identities. Because these things are formed on narrow insurgencies, they exclude majority of people who didn't participate in this. Certain ethnic groups that were not done are then excluded. But thirdly, the opposition to the Ottoman Empire, given that the Ottoman Empire is the premise on which Islamic identity was brought, leads to oppression of Islamic persons, which Erasmus would explain in most of these instances. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate inside opposition, I call upon the leader of UP. Here. Daniel, I do not seem to see Adam in the call.
Oh. Okay. He just said that his computer is restarting. He'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay,
So I guess the timer. Yeah.
I'm gonna set the timer to 3 minutes, and if not, I think you sadly need to iron person this room.
All right. Sounds good. Do you know at what point he left?
I am not sure at what point they left.
Oh no, that's not very good.
Okay, I see Adam is here now. Adam?
Yeah.
You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me? How much time do I have left?
Your speech
No,
should start.
you can start whenever you want.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. My computer tried restarting.
Okay.
Okay. All right, I'll get my timer up.
Wait,
that
there's
case-
two of you, Adam.
Okay.
Adam, you muted yourself again.
All right, I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel. The reason that opening opposition wins this debate is that we understand the comparative, which is that the governments in these states are still going to want to push nationalist narratives, and that on our side, the nationalist narratives are going to be significantly worse. I'm going to start out with some quick framing and description, and then I'll get into our arguments. All right, so just to be clear, what we care about for this debate is not about absolute historical accuracy. In case any team tries to bring this up, like all historical curriculum will be warped in some way. This debate is based on the outcomes of information in the education. Now, in what way does curriculum actually affect us? So notice that curriculum is used as a tool to point people towards what is important. It points them towards that which has given them injustice in the past and that which they should focus on as something to repair for their country in the future. If you have been colonized, it tells you who has done that and what you need to do to fix that. So what is the likely alternative? Notice that governments massively benefit from having nationalist sentiment, as OG's case entirely agrees with. This is for a few reasons. A, it means you have a harder working population because they want to work for their country. B, it means you have less crime and antisocial behavior because they don't want to harm your country in comparison to whatever external enemy you have. C, the biggest one is that you have more complicity in authoritarianism because it means that you care about your nation and are afraid what will happen to you without it because you have a natural level of ethnic fear to the outside world. And D, or 4, it means you can be mobilized much more easily militarily when you have been taught nationalist sentiments from a young age. As the government is going to decide the curriculum, this means that they are going to be indoctrinating children no matter what. This means that they instead need to focus on so without this focus on Ottoman historical tensions, they will need to focus on other historical tensions. Note that when you're able to create an enemy, this makes people much more in fear, meaning that they are much more likely to kowtow to the demands of an oppressive government, and they are much more likely to be aggressive, which is useful for, again, military mobilization, police force engagement, this kind of things. For these reasons, we think that engagement with the other Balkan states and the history of the conflict with other Balkan states is what's likely to be taught in schools because it is the only thing that fulfills this requirement properly on without the history of the Ottoman Empire. Now, and it is also something which is heavily emotionally poignant and that people are likely to respond to in the short term, which is also the term that is most useful for these politicians. Now, why is this a terrible idea? Notice this is going to destroy the unity of the Balkan states to whatever extent it previously existed. Because notice, there's a huge history of ethnic tensions in the Balkan states. This is where the term Balkanization comes from. This is for a few reasons. A, there are not many unifying factors despite their geographic locations. So like as nationalism is one of the ways that people find their identity, there is more reason to like fall into the narcissism of small differences. There's a lot of reasons for them to be harshly competitive with each other and this kind of thing. B, it means there's also just a huge conflict or huge history of conflict like the Balkan Wars and like the failed identity building project like of the state of Yugoslavia. This has been a huge issue in the past and will continue to be so in the future. What this means is that on our side, we reduce Balkan ethnic conflict for two reasons. The first mechanism here is that having the Ottomans as an enemy displaces negative energy. People naturally look for a scapegoat in their lives, and like when bad things happen, people want a reason to explain their suffering, something to make it meaningful. This occurs between all groups and times and places. There's people who blame literally just any of their political opponents for something because it makes like life just more parsable and less scary. The issue then is that this is not something that's going to end either on an individual level or on a politician level. The thing here is that right now Ottomans are used as a scapegoat, but like without the Ottomans' presence in history as something that is like the cause of your problems, that negative energy will now be displaced onto your current neighbors, onto the people who are directly beside you and often like might have some of that ethnic group living in your country. The second thing is that this creates the second mechanism is that it reduces Balkan ethnic tensions because it creates positive bondings. When there's an understanding that all of the Balkans were like, oppressed by the Ottoman Empire and have that shared history, it at least creates some level of like shared trauma. It creates some understanding that while they might hate each other right now, there are still causes that like matter more to them than like their differences and fightings with each other. That, if the Ottoman Empire resurged, they would want to do something about that and fight against that. We think that this is something which is important for leading to any level of peace in the area. So why are our arguments particularly important? Three things. One, we have less violence on our side when we have greater Balkan unity. Notice that this means things like individual ethnic violence, because that is pretty common. Two, it means things like less border skirmishes, people being killed because of like, these like small political maneuverings. And three, it means that especially with the disintegration of the global order that the US was previously upholding, and that like Russia has been directly undermining with things like the Ukraine war, it means less chance of war breaking out in the future. We don't know what it's going to look like in the next 20, 30 years for like the international order, and we think war is a legitimate like possibility. Two, it means better trade and development. The Balkans are still largely developing countries, and it's important that they have neighbors who they are able to work well with and who they're not likely to be sanctioned by tariff, this kind of thing. Economic development is important for improving people's base quality of life massively. Three, it means we have things like less risk of authoritarianism, because notice, and here's the most important point, Ottomans are scary, but they are largely irrelevant. Like they're from the 19th century, like the Ottoman Empire as such no longer exists, and like Turkey like is not aggressive towards the Balkans right now. This means it is a less effective way of scaring people into authoritarianism. When you have neighbors directly on your border, people directly beside you who are scaring you, who like you have direct conflict with, that is much more reason to submit to an authoritarian leader. The Ottoman Empire is not going to come back, but they're like Croatia might. Like the thing is, like with all our impacts, essentially, like you are trading off the ability to scapegoat a faraway actor, someone who is largely irrelevant and not going to like cause problems for trade, and you're trading that off with directly nearby countries who are going to have very real conflict with. And for those reasons, we are incredibly proud to oppose in this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in opening government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Give me a second to put the sheets together, and I'll start with the So starting my timer, most likely I'll take a POI in my 5 minutes from chat. If I've still not taken it and it's past 5 minutes, you can softly ask via voice, because sometimes my timer messes up. So if Judge, you could maybe just tell me when it's 5 minutes, I'm very grateful. Yeah, so that I can engage. Most likely from CO, I'll love to engage with your extension. All right. 3, 2, 1. Notice that the way in which opening opposition exactly wants this narrative to thrive in order for them to have their impact is specifically why this narrative is very bad. You don't just judge the debate per what they've said, you need to analyze it on the comparative. On our side, we still get to reflect on this history, however, in more forms in which it allows for discourse and for more accountability. I'm going to show you why in their world, the level of discourse which is had is very coercive, especially in trying to remove these impacts. The second problem with opening opposition is maybe lack of basic knowledge about things outside of the West. But then what you do notice is there's a straight jump from showing that this narrative can be used to be able to mobilize the regions and the groups. Notice that they do not respond to any of the arguments from Andrews, which tells you that there is a lot of focus on the tribes and ethnic groups which were part of the liberation movement at the exclusion of other tribes who did not partake in this. Notice that he told you that there was a rich history where most of these tribes and ethnic groups lived in harmony and were together, and there are incentives by those ruling right now to be able to paint a gory picture about those times in order for them to emphasize their rule now. Without responding to those things, they do not win. And the win against them and against all of bottom half is that every other impact depends on this specific comparison or justification, in the sense that if you're able to have proper discourse over our history with the Ottoman Empire, that is when we are likely to have any other impacts that CG is still likely to organize. Tell you. So why would this be done in a bad way? And I just want you to use your intuition pump. Look at the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, where there is Kosovo broke away and there's continuous oppression, right? Look at the several separatist movements which continue to exist within the Balkan regions, where this narrative is used as a justification to oppress them, and where this narrative then influences more ethnic groups to feel like they can never be part of this state, given that they can never turn back the clocks of time and engage in the struggle against the Ottomans. This then means that there's far more likelihood that ethnic groups in themselves want to even be able to separate, even if they do say that they want to use this narrative to bring them together. It means the method by which they can bring them together is violence. We'll show you why that in itself is bad. But why is this used in a bad way? One, it is used emotionally. It is connected to people's lived experiences. It tells them that it is their identity, and therefore if it is touched, they themselves are violated. People want to be able to hold on dear to this because it is what is taught in schools. It is taught over and over and over again. So the next generation comes and they do not question it because their grandfathers tell it in stories from the very storybooks which they have told it from. And therefore there is less opposition to it, and there's confirmation bias which comes. It is associated with powerful narratives which continue to ensure this. And there's a vicious picture which is painted in that instance. The origins or the past is painted as one that was dire, poor, and desperate, and it was one that they shouldn't be able to return to. Why is there an incentive to do this? Because the elites who led the revolution are the ones who continue to store power and continue to benefit from this. They are the same ones who write the education curriculum, given that most of these states mostly run education based on the state levels, and they write the curriculum. It means they are more likely to paint it in a way that reflects their heroics, and it means that they are far more likely to evade accountability because people do not question them. How does this narrative play out on the comparative? It means we open it up for more questioning. It means different sources, different authors can be able to contribute to this, given that it's only a point of history. But on their side, states care too much about it and therefore want to control it, and no one wants to question that level of identity which comes. This level, without this level of scrutiny, it means that we are unable to break the power which these rulers are able to exert over them. Why are the incentives for inclusion and accountability removed? One, there's a focus on these slim insurgencies limited to a few groups, given that now the elites rule, and we've shown you that they have reasons to rule in a very, very bad way that continues to lock out minority groups and continue to entrench their power, because that exclusivity is what fuels that power. Two, they are likely to deflect problems in status quo to state oppression, which necessarily happened in the past during the Ottoman Empire, to be able to paint the picture picture that it's not as bad as it was, and we were the ones who removed you, and therefore we can't be able to do it again. We think this narrative is very, very hard to break, even with the votes. Secondly, they paint the previous picture as so bad before. It means that they continue to alienate different groups, even within those times, given that it gives them justification for that power. Two, the persecution of Islam. Look at Turkish Serbs who exist within Serbia because of these same relations, given that Islam came with the Ottomans. Look at things like the Yalova Peninsula massacre, where in the past thousands of these guys were massacred, but however, there's no remuneration or justification for them right now. Even in the present, there's continuous marginalization and exclusion because they are consistently blamed for the problems, and that's why you see majority of Muslims living within the Balkans moving into countries like Kosovo and then Albania. Thirdly, in terms of foreign relations, one, the foreign relations with Turkey and other states which continue to have remnants of the Ottoman Empire continues to deteriorate. The reason why this is bad is because it continues to fuel more conflict, which means that you are raising armies, continually wasting resources in order for you to be able to save this up. This money could have gone to schools, buildings, and to educating like the people and giving them food, which means that relations with Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia are terrible. On the comparative, you can benefit from them in terms of trade security. You don't do that. POI from CO.
Yeah, so even without a regulated historical curriculum, states can still be corruptive in their political interests. Why is it exclusive on your side?
Yeah. I mean, I'm coming to that soon. Why is the justification for this narrative? Because we do think that on our side, there is far more improvement, because I told you that when the discourse is correct and this discourse is one that is pure, we are able to check or we're able to hold the states accountable, which means we are more likely to enforce democratic checks. It also means that we are able to ensure international checks and accountability. Why? Because in status quo, they use this narrative to say, we don't want to be colonized again, and therefore do not listen to them. We're able to break that barrier and ensure this level of accountability. So we showed you two methods, internal and then external. Even if you still want to say it's for reparations, to the extent that we are still able to teach most of these things, we think that we're able to do so. But even in doing so, there's less incentives to be able to oppress people right now. In status quo, they're able to deflect most of these problems to the past oppressors without holding themselves accountable. We think that even if states will be corrupt, the only part in our world where we're able to ensure accountability is when we show you how this narrative necessarily plays out. Even if it does not reduce corruption in its entirety, we solve massive harms in the way in which these states can be checked and in the way in which people can be able to use their power to be able to hold the states accountable in most instances. When this discourse is pure, it's educational, can hold counter narratives and can introduce the level of discourse which is hard and it's not strongly tied to people's identity, we're able to have every impact that everyone wants to analyze within this debate. We are proud to propose and win this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the opening half, I call upon the Deputy Leader of the OP. Here.
All right. All right, am I audible?
Audible and visible.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be taking POIs audibly roughly around 5 minutes from closing government. I'm not going to be taking it any earlier. All right. I'm going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. Honorable Speaker, a couple of key observations about what opening government did wrong in this debate. Then after that, some more thorough refutation. Lastly, some weighing, because at the end of the day, we can see that there's probably some truth to opening government's debate, but there's going to have to exist some kind of trade-off between what we want for these countries, and that's what we're going to debate on the premises of what is best and what we want for these countries, given that trade-offs are going to have to exist in the first place. So my first observation is that opening government accused us of not being exclusive. The main problem with this is that this House opposes motion. And what that necessarily entails is that what we've had to hear from opening government is what is the likely alternative. The problem is that they don't have the fiat power to just assert that everything that they say happens, that all these different comparators exist. We had not really good image or comparative of characterization about what is actually going to happen. What is this moderation effect that's going to happen? What is this type of discourse that we're going to have? So this is the problem on the strategic strategic front and then the meta debate. Because if their case is purely negative, they have to prove that this type of focus or emphasis is objectively bad because they don't have any positive constructive on their side of the house as to why their world is good. So what that necessarily means in terms of burdens for opposition is that all we have to prove is either mess up that make it so messy that you believe that it's unclear, or that their case was at best mitigatory, because it means even if we have a small impact left at the end, that means that we're going to be taking on this debate from opening government. The second thing then that I want to say is that this debate is likely to exist on fringes. Look, I concede on opening opposition, we probably talked about some pretty big impacts, and so did opening government. The problem is that we have to read this motion and understand the scope of what we are talking about. We are necessarily talking about the emphasis of the Ottoman Empire in the history curriculum of Balkan countries. What this necessarily means is that we have to understand causality in this chain in order to understand the relevance of this motion and applicable arguments. Because notably, causality is a thing that can happen due to a lot of factors. The reasons why the Balkans and countries in the Balkans could be corrupt is for so many different reasons, as were already pointed out from top to bottom of the bench, including the COPOI, that I think was fairly obvious in that regard, right? The many reasons could be including the legacies even of this type of colonialism that happened, but could also be things like enduring poverty that makes it really easy to abuse your population in terms of like having these strong armed governments that convince you that receding democratic norms is going to be a good thing. It could be because of all the other ethnic tensions that you're able to manipulate and able to capitalize on that in order to have corruption. And most notably, if a government is corrupt, they probably still have an incentive to stay corrupt because they're able to benefit from handing out positions to their own friends, to their allies. So to that extent, I think that the main conclusion becomes here is that A, I'm unsure how any of this actually changes to a meaningful extent on their side. And just because we're not talking about the Ottoman Empire in terms of a way that they could like necessarily like be I'm just unclear how this accountability manifests on their side, that suddenly we're not taught that Ottoman Empire was the central enemy and a lot of the emphasis of our struggles. That means suddenly that people are going to be more oriented to want to check on the government and more likely to say, that's BS, right? Because again, they have an incentive to stay in power. My partner explained to you that to stay in power, they have an incentive to forge a national identity. So either way, they're going to forge a national identity that's going to be best interest and best suited in order for them to stay in power. So the question is, who is this going to be tailored around? Who's going to be included as narrative? And that's what this debate is around. And they had some arguments on that, and I'll get to that as well. So what I also think then is that I think the implication of this is I think that the strongest arguments in this round are not going to be the ones that are going to justify radical transformations in public, in like, the public, right? That we're all going to have like the most educated people, we're going to have the most economic prowess. It's probably going to be an individual level, right? It's going to be how individuals internalize this identity, and it's how individuals internalize this education, and how they choose to make decisions at an individual level. This is the link that was probably the most important in this round. So then, what is going to be the comparatives, and what are going to be the different splits in this round? So what we talked to you about is now national identity and how it's important, right? The most important part we think on opening opposition of national identity is how it defines how you feel about yourself in relation to other people. I think it has things on like moderates effects on like ethnic identity, ethnocentrism, how you feel about your economic deprivation, and majority minority positions on individual and collective behavior. The strongest point we heard out of opening government then on that basis is probably going to be about who's included in this narrative and who isn't. And they had two central premises on this. Firstly, their premise was that individuals that were involved within the conflict at that time, whatever the dominant groups were probably going to be the ones that are going to be the only ones included in this narrative. The reason why I think that probably doesn't matter is because, look, at the end of the day, if you look at the counterfactual, if you pick a different conflict, there's also going to be certain groups. The question then becomes, which groups do we want to choose, right? Would we rather choose the groups that are going to be, let's just say, a little bit of history, by the way, one of the Balkan wars was literally started in response to Ottoman Empire, resulted in unity of all Balkans. Would we want to choose one that revolves around a narrative where we have a unity of all Balkans, or would we rather want to choose one where we have, like, for for example, a hero from like recent Balkan conflicts that we had against another Balkan country, right? So to that extent, I think that also like you're probably just gonna pick someone anyways. So to that extent, I don't think that stands. I think the strongest point they probably have then here is on like the Muslim populations. Here's a problem. I probably posit to you that there's going to be racism against Muslim populations nonetheless. And the main reason why is because of current affairs, because of like, for example, the mass migration because of Middle East, fear of the different and Islamophobia because they weren't the ethnic dominant population anyways. And as a minority by population throughout history, they're probably always going to be blamed or pinned to some extent. And see, I don't see this as a reason why you're going to get that much difference. At the end of the day, then, what we are proposing to you is that this is a way to form a national identity that is centered around a unity, because all the Balkan countries were focused on this Balkan war, but also a way to focus around it that you're not going to be pinning each other. That means at an individual level, when you are taught not to emphasize or focus on one thing, because naturally that your parents might be talking about that or something else, that means that you are able to not focus on that conflict. Notably, there's a lot of intermix between Balkan populations in different countries as well. These might exist, but these conflicts are far worse. Why? Because you're bordering each other. This is the delta. Because you're not bordering any other country besides Turkey, and you're not going to invade them. So the problem is that this racism could stoke inter-country conflict and internal conflict. Inside, it could be only maybe internal conflict between minority populations. Look, honorable speaker, the trade-off sucks. It's going to be violence or microaggressions against one population versus other, but the other one has the capacity to stoke a lot more violence. We proved to you how we get there by focusing on different heroes, how the counterfactual exists on their side of the house, and that is why we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I am going to pause the recording. I call upon the member of opposition here.
Just checking if I'm audible.
You're audible and visible.
Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think it's clear that the debate has progressed to the point where we want to ensure that the multi-ethnic groups or the ethnic groups within the Balkan states are able to coexist and are able to unify. The question then becomes whether or not the inclusion or the emphasis on the Turkish atrocities in the past is the best way for you to unify or not. But before that, our extension is really simple, right? The problem with OO is that while they did a good job in explaining why, like, there are why contributions or there's a common struggle, they don't explain two important things. Firstly, they don't explain to you why there is a prevalence and the importance of nationalism in a lot of these Balkan states. We are primarily developing countries that rely on nationalism in order to keep the country from falling apart. But secondly, they don't necessarily use a correct historical narrative, and they rely on the fabrication of history in order to create that. We'll prove to you why actual history will probably be something that is inclusive as intuitively and without necessarily becoming truistic. Right. So before I move on, let's just do like a really quick rebuttal to CG. CG's alternative is basically that they want to create a narrative and focusing on accountability of past atrocities, like, for example, the Serbs or against the Kosovans or whatever for their genocide. I think, notice, Chair, that this is not mutually exclusive. We can focus or emphasize on the Turkish atrocities and the colonialism from there, but we can also say that we want to ensure that these groups have accountability for the atrocities that they've done. These things are not mutually exclusive. They are not against each other. We think that we can teach those two things at the same time. I don't think then CG's case necessarily is not necessarily something that's better than UG. Moving on. First, what is nationalism and what role does it play in the Balkan states? I think nationalism, especially in a lot of developing countries, something that's important in order to make sure that the country doesn't fall apart, because often institutions are weak in order to ensure that groups are able to keep in line. Therefore, they need to create a common identity to ensure that people actually stay in the country and are actually able to, just coexist with each other, right? Therefore, then the question then becomes, is nationalism something that's exclusive or inclusive, right? The answer is no. The answer is that nationalism is inclusive, and we can see that in most developing countries that rely on nationalism to make sure that countries don't fall apart, right? It tends to be egalitarian, to ensure that a common identity, right? We can see this in countries like, for example, Ethiopia, Malaysia, etc., that they have a unique national identity that accommodates or is able to include as many ethnic minorities as possible. And the way that they're able to identify is not through the ethnicity themselves, but rather the group's contributions towards the national identity. For example, right? If that group is able to struggle against a common enemy, that means then that you are automatically included in the national identity. And therefore, that's a lot of how countries are able to have ethnicities create common identities, right? Therefore, that means then that the question is simple, right? That means that this is also true in a lot of Balkan states, that they're developing countries, that they need to be able, like very multi-ethnic countries that have gone through a lot of conflict and a lot of colonization. Therefore, they need to be able to glue these people together, right? Therefore, then the question becomes, can ethnic groups be included within the history of the Ottoman Empire and the colonialism and the violence axis? This is purely extension, very important in comparison to OO. Then we answer this by telling you what does the struggle look like. Before I go on, CG. OG?
Sure. In Malaysia, you focus on the Melayu, you don't focus on the Indian Malays. Why is it that you won't focus on the white Orthodox Christians in this worldview rather than Malaysian, like for example, the Muslims that I explained to you in my ethno-nationalist argument?
Yeah, I'm going to explain to you what the struggle actually looked like. But the reason why Malaysia is actually not that bad is because the alternative was Malay identity only. But the reason why Malaysians exist and why we're able to include Chinese and Indians into that national identity was because they were also part of the independence movement in order to fight against the British. Moving on, what does the struggle look like and what does it include the minorities? The struggle against the Ottoman Empire was something that was extremely diverse. The reason why is because A, colonialism and war meant that the Ottomans displaced or forcibly removed or relocated a lot of people from different areas around the world, right? That meant that you have the Macedonians being pushed north into like the Serbia, You had the Albanians pushed north. You had the Croats shifted around, etc. Because this is a hallmark of colonialism as to how you relocate certain ethnic groups, and you are able, like, they were displaced because of war. They were also displaced because of their wanting to maintain power. But secondly, non-Turkish Muslims. This is very important, Chair, that non-Turkish Muslims are also extremely oppressed as well. The reason why is because Turks were extremely racist against non-Turkish converts. If you look at Albanians, right, they are not necessarily viewed nicely in Turkey, or they're not necessarily viewed nicely in historical context because of the fact that they posed a threat to Muslims or Turks' power when they are able to access the Muslim quote-unquote institutions that the Ottoman Empire tried to represent. Thirdly, is because the Ottoman Empire was extremely badly managed to everyone involved that's not inside Turkey. The things like, for example, the oppressive stuff that they did was like, for example, banning basic things like basic education, books, etc. That meant that, and also like just a lot of atrocities, right? That meant that everyone outside of Turkey was screwed over equally because they wanted to maintain power, and everyone felt the same struggle. Therefore, in conclusion, the way that people struggled against the Turks was the struggle was extremely multi-ethnic because everyone was sort of equally screwed, even if you're a Muslim outside of Turkey. Therefore, why is this extremely important? This relates back to what I proved earlier about how then you're able to use the narrative of nationalism in order to make sure that minorities have level of political leverage in order to reduce oppression or make oppression unjustifiable in these states, right? The fact is that minorities can use the past historical atrocities that they have faced, or the fact that they are actually included in the struggle against Ottomans in order to say that, hey, we are part of your national identity. This is not justified for you to fight against us. But number two, and this is directly engaging with government's strongest scenario, right? Which is that Muslims are often like sort of the collateral damage that you have, is that this characterization shows that Muslims are not the primary determinant identity that sort of forces people to be oppressive. It's not Muslims or the religion, but rather it's race, that is Turks, right? Therefore, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim living in Serbia. It matters that you are not a Turk. You are actually an Albanian, or you are Albanian and you were oppressed by the Turks equally, or you were part of the struggle against Ottomans, etc. What that means then is that we actually get all the benefits that OO tries to say in a better way when we actually prove to you that A, nationalism is often the key for minorities to gain political leverage in order to deal with oppression. Number two is that we actually tell you why Muslims will not be the collateral damage that OG or CG tries to say. For all of those reasons, we actually solve the problem.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate as a whole, I call up on the up whip. Here.
Hello, can I just check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. Give me a second. All right. Set my timer. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'll be up with. I prefer POIs in the chat and I will take one by 5. Please don't spam. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2. The strength of a narrative lies in the affirmation by apolitical institutions in order for that narrative to even matter or to be viable in the first place. Chair, CG was debating in the extremes when they believe emphasizing equals to fabrication. And I think this was kind of, we can kind of see this happen throughout all the teams in this debate when they weren't able to see in reality what emphasization actually looks like. We don't fabricate or rewrite history, but rather we tell it, but we shine a light on one particular narrative that we want to push. As OO kind of correctly points out, it is the fact that we're trying to paint the picture that the Balkan states were unified, were cooperative, and shared the common struggle against the Ottoman Empire, and they were able to like rise up beyond that and defeat that and like become better and develop, so on and so forth. That is the kind of emphasis that actually exists, but rather the entire government bench wanted to go on the extremes and believe it is utter fabrication and that all of their harms is based upon that claim and that assumption alone. And for that reason alone, they kind of already lose out in this debate. For any post-colonial states, unity is often the greatest priority because with the absence of a ruling entity, conflicts are bound to happen. In the context of Balkan states, it's a bit more unique. A, the Ottoman Empire had interest throughout the Balkan region, therefore colonization was spread equally. B, no singular Balkan state had military leverage that compared to the Ottomans, and due to the size of its occupation, even if a singular state was able to win, it will not be beneficial due to their close proximity to affected states. But C, no singular state could do this exclusively due to the nature of regional colonization that increased displacement of different ethnics and religion. Their state identities were spread out and therefore are pushed to identify under the Balkan umbrella. Also a characterization that exclusively came under CO, when we say it's not national identity that these people are prioritizing, but rather that regional identity in which you as a Balkan country, country and therefore region were affected equally. No POIs yet. Why is this point of clarification important? A, because during opening exchange, we heard really smart things on what may happen, but without the grounding that CO provided, they simply exist as assertions. But B, it is the ground of CO's extension, that without the curriculum, unification and recovery of these states would have been impossible, and they would have most likely be even more discriminatory and divided and polarized at the end of the day. I have a couple of issues for me to resolve. The first, whether the absence of an emphasis to its struggles against Ottoman would affect efforts of Balkan unification. OG claims that history curriculums are the most powerful medium of influence that allows governments to be corruptive and abusive. We question this in several levels. No, thank you, OG. First, how strong are school curriculums to influence such an action? Because we think it can promote a common understanding or push a shared sentiment, but we don't think it can disrupt individual rationality. What does it mean? It is most likely to empower a community rather than blind them to abuse. And if they were to blind them to abuse, then it would be total fabrication, which doesn't happen in reality. Why is this true? There are 3 metrics to judge this on. Number 1, what actually happened historically. 2, what parts are emphasized and for what reason. 3, whether they can rewrite the entirety of history. OG's claim is that states paint themselves as divine saviors and thus most powerful. Why is that untrue? 1, they have to rewrite history, which they can't due to external check and balances like international curriculums, peer review mechanisms, and textbooks that you have to go through, as well as apolitical institutions like universities who are going to either strengthen your narrative or get rid of it in totality. But B, if it was true, it means your Balkan societies are passive and worship the state so much that you are abused beyond comprehension. Not the case, because as you can see in Serbia-Kosovo conflict that brought about protests in regards to EU extension efforts, that these people are in fact democratized and politically active. Instead, and like Kim CG's claims that Muslims are made into the common enemy, which is also untrue because local Muslims here are part of the struggle who were tortured for being a different sector and for pledging support to somebody else rather than the Uthman Caliphate that was painted in within the historical curriculums themselves. That is to say, minorities deserve or have a better chance of political leverage under our side of the house when they can identify with the common struggle of what the Ottoman Empire did to the Balkan states. Instead, what actually happened happened? All talked about national identity, but we edge over them for being significantly more nuanced and accurate across all Balkan countries. That they emphasized on two things. Number one, unification and regional cooperation that led to the ability to weaken Ottoman Empire. That states were being painted as strategic and the people were being painted as brave because they are there to like shed blood for their country, so on, so forth. What was the incentive to do this? And what was the incentive to do this? A is the need for regional dependency due to lack of resources, something that wasn't appreciated underneath like other themes in this debate. But B, the nature of post-Ottoman diversity by virtue of displacement. And this is in direct response to government bench's claim that Ottoman colonization caused for less diversity. Absolutely untrue, because pre-Ottoman, those states were monolithic with very little incentive of migration, and also due to the emirs and caliphs wanting a diverse pool of followers within their constituencies. Before I move on, Oji.
Panel, check your notes. We framed a counterfactual pre-colonization before a day zero and showed how anti-Islamic sentiments target minority tribes and hurt foreign relations. Maybe CG was in the bathroom, but CEO needs to show why the proper discourse and accountability we get through multiple authorities doesn't give minorities the power, but rather the narrative which is controlled by the elites who want to exclude them.
So 3 reasons, right? Number 1, political interests aren't based off of school curriculums. They are based out of political interest, out of current agendas. 9/11, for example, those are all of the stronger points of opposition that they have against Muslims, not the historical view of what had happened back then, given that we were able to prove that local Muslims suffered egregiously the same as other people in those states. Moving on, C, the incentive to do this is the need to rid of civil wars and further polarization of their societies, given the need of recovery. What's the conclusion? A, government bench's entire harms were based on an unsubstantial claim, and OG in particular were assumptive and non-comparative. B, no analysis that supports accountability without nationalism will lead to the benefits they claim. This is very important because accountability alone would spark hatred and distrust toward the state that often reminds us of how bad and like majoritarians are brave. But rather, the alternative we support that's actually happening is co-opting accountability with nationalism, because they will at least want to change something out of love rather than distrust to the state. And the prevalent proof of this are that the state is morally good due to the history curriculum, showing us that they were able to cooperate, so on, so forth. The empowerment happens better under our side of the house. For all of those reasons and the fact that CG has 0 exclusive hubs, we take this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, and thank you all for the debate.